Hey everybody, ronarray here, and GGG just revealed the new leak together with initial patch notes. There has already been a lot of doom and gloom around the patch notes itself, since this time we had a lot of nerfs. However, some things been actually buffed as well, and some good skills are just completely untouched. It's important to remember that those patch notes are not complete, and we will get more information later on. In this video, I wanted to showcase the biggest winners and losers of the changes based on the patch notes that we currently have. I would also like to talk more about how changes will affect both the builds and the endgame. If you enjoy such an analysis, feel free to subscribe to not miss the next videos when we will get more information. Let's go! And first, let's start with the buffs. So, in the buff section, I'm mostly going to cover the skills that people actually played. I'm not going to showcase every little improvement, so let's just focus on the things that could translate to proper builds in 3.27. And first off, it's a Dark Pact. Dark Pact stacking pretty nice with life stacking builds in general. And with the new improvement, I think it will deal even more damage than before. Considering with new Ascendancies, GG also showcased some improvements for life stacking builds, I believe Dark Pact will be in a pretty nice position, or at least better than it's been before. Right now you will have more critical strike chance, so 7% instead of 5% for Dark Pact, and it will sacrifice more life, so 12% instead of 8%, which is going to lead to more damage in general. The same buff is also applied to Dark Pact of Tartarus, which is not that popular, however playable at the moment as well. It also received a pretty nice improvement for 500% of sacrificed life as chaos damage in the last when you have like 7 ruin instead of 400, which can make Dark Pact of Tartarus a little more popular. And the next thing that been improved, even if not that heavily, is Spellslinger. There are currently not a lot of Spellslinger builds, however with that improvement GG definitely want us to make some. So right now for Spellslinger you will have 30 to 20% less damage with hits compared to 37 to 31 that we had before, which is a pretty significant improvement because 20% less damage instead of 31 is pretty big. The bigger issue with Spellslinger that currently not a lot of builds are using it because of reservation and additional conditions that you need to meet to use it. And the next skill which got buffed is pretty much Cyclone. Cyclone always been fan favorite, especially for the starters, and just for pure physical Cyclone builds. Cyclone got 20% more damage with no downside. Same with Cyclone of Tumult, so right now 20% more damage at all gem levels, no downside whatsoever. I think it will make Cyclone even more popular as leveling and league starter option. Even in the endgame, people usually repick from Cyclone to some other skill which showcasing better endgame results. And another skill that people played a lot before and it currently got buffed is Boneshatter. So Boneshatter right now is going to deal more damage based on trauma. So if before we had like 2 to 4%, right now we have 3 to 6%. So improvement is pretty big. Instead of 4 we have 6% damage more per trauma, and I think it can make Boneshatter a little more popular. However, the biggest issue with Boneshatter right now that strength-based builds are usually playing Earthshatter or maybe going to play other kind of slam skills. That making Boneshatter a little fall off because it has less AoE and it generally harder to play it. However, Boneshatter is still going to be very popular, especially for hardcore, considering the damage went up. And another skill that been very nice before and people still playing it, especially with combination with mines, is Exsanguinate. Right now, Exsanguinate will deal 15% more base physical damage per second with a debuff. Same goes for Exsanguinate of Transmission. I think Exsanguinate always been a nice option for clear, there have been multiple builds for it, both with mines and just with a self-cast too, and I believe Exsanguinate right now will be a nice option for clear, especially at the league start conditions. And another thing that got buffed is Explosive Concoction. I wouldn't say that it's just a very basic buff, it's mostly like reshuffle all of the numbers. So Right now, Explosive Concoction will deal less fire damage at gem levels 1 to 20, but it will deal more cold damage based off Sapphire Flask, lightning damage based on Topaz Flask, and the damage over time multiplier with Ignite based on Ruby Flask. I think that bonus is pretty significant, because amount of damage is almost doubled based on the flask that you are using. And I think in general, Explosive Concoction got buffed because in the end you're going to deal just more damage overall. However, definitely some tests in the game required here, considering the numbers got shuffled a lot. Next skill that been popular some time ago but fell from grace and got buffed is Volatile Dead. Volatile Dead orb explosions will deal 25% more damage at all gem levels and will have 210 damage effectiveness instead of 170. Same goes for Volatile Dead of Thieving and Volatile Dead of Confinement, which got a little base explosions. Radius, so 2 meters instead of 1.5. I believe that Volatile Dead fell from grace mostly because it's not dealing enough damage, and I think that buff can resurrect the skill, and some people could definitely try to play it, especially considering that Volatile Dead is usually combined with Spellslinger, and since Spellslinger got buffed as well, improvement for Volatile Dead is pretty significant. There have also been other small buffs, such as for example Chain Hook, or small bonus to damage over time for Reap, or for example additional bonuses for Siege Ballista of Tartarus, and Spectre of Helix attack speed improvement. However, I think those don't really worth the mentioning because they're not going to affect endgame at all, either because the skills are not popular or because the buff itself is too small to force people into playing it. And for the nerfs, GG went for big offenders. First off, it's Volcanic Fissure of Snaken. Right now, Volcanic Fissure no longer will have 50% more area of effect, and fissures will not automatically target enemies hit by explosion of the previous fissure in the chain. So that combination is definitely going to damage the fissure, because it's going to affect the clear and it will be harder to pilot the skill itself. However, I don't think that those nerf is going to kill Volcanic Fissure of Snaken completely. Since the damage is still staying there, I think some people will still play it, even if the coverage and AoE is definitely falling off. And another skill that got significantly nerfed is BAMA. So Blink Arrow of Bombarding Clones and Mirror Arrow of Bombarding Clones. Right now, clones will deal roughly 33% less damage with a rain of arrows for bombarding clones, and minion duration will be 5 seconds instead of 20 seconds. Same goes for prismatic clones, but they will deal like 20% less damage. So 33% less damage on bombarding clones is very big. You're losing a big percentage of damage for nothing, and minion duration is going to make the build a little harder to just stack up, because before we've been using buffs based on the duration of enemies for BAMA. Right now those buffs will be much harder to maintain, and BAMA is definitely not a great option and not in a very good position for 3.27. I really feel like that nerf is a little overkill, considering BAMA never been too strong and never dealt like billions of damage. And I would prefer GG to probably nerf BAMA a little less, so like 15% less damage could keep the skill playable, and you still would have less BAMA domination in minion field in general. However, I believe that such nerf with 33% less damage on bombarding clones is going to make BAMA still playable, but very niche at the moment. And there have been also multiple skills with just reshuffle. First off, it's Winter Orb. It will now fire a projectile every 1.2 seconds, it's previously been 1.6, but will have 80% more projectile frequency while channeling compared to 125 before. Those changes will lead us to almost the same result like we had before, and I believe it will be a little slower right now, but I can consider it a big nerf, and Winter Orb players probably will not notice that big of a difference. And another gem being Reshuffled, which is Pyroclast Mine. It now deals 35% more damage at all gem levels, and fires additional projectile for every 3 prior mines and detonation sequence. It previously been 4, which is a pretty decent buff. It will now have a more effectiveness of added damage. It's 110 instead of 80, and fire exposure with -15 to fire resistance. However, Pyroclast Mine is currently going to work differently. So, placed Pyroclast Mines no longer will have aura that adds fire damage to hits against enemies near them. They instead will apply an aura that inflicts fire exposure. The effect of this exposure scales with the effect of auras, but multiple placed mines do not cause exposure to effect to be higher. I think generally, Pyroclast Mine still looks buffed from my eyes. However, changing that aura could hurt it at some particular situations. So we will need to test more in Path of Building and in the game later on to confirm if the skills like buffed or nerfed. But improvement for amount of projectiles and damage effectiveness should compensate the aura that we're losing, at least in theory, and that's what GG tried to achieve there. Unfortunately, fire exposure, on the other hand, is not that good, and it's not going to affect skill a lot. And another skill that got reshuffled is Posonous Concoction. Right now, for Posonous Concoction, you will deal less chaos damage in base, so 800 at max against 1000 that we had before. But you will have more added chaos damage from Flask, so 16% instead of 11. And right now, I believe that Posonous Concoction is staying almost the same, or maybe we can even consider it a slight buff at the moment. Same goes for Posonous Concoction of Bouncing. I believe both skills are absolutely playable and there's not a lot of issues. After we finished with the skills, I think it's a very nice moment to mention what is untouched. I believe the big winners of the patch should be the skills that completely untouched. In that case, it should be skills like Kinetic Blast, for example, Smite, or Forbidden Riot of Soul Sacrifice. I consider all of them like winners because none of them been nerfed significantly. Also, skills like Blade Vortex could become a little more popular together with other variations that people played less before. All of them could be considered very good at the moment, and they'll probably get more attention than before since Volcanic Fissure and BAMA went out of the picture. So now let's talk about Ascendancies, and here we mostly got nerfs. The good option is just like Assassin got redone, and right now I think Assassin could be a very nice option for various poison-based builds, especially spell builds like Poison Spark, for example. But I wouldn't say that Assassin got overbuffed and right now will be too popular, because it still feels like a niche Ascendancy which could be played, but mostly based on some particular part of the game, and it's not going to be an absolute killer. So on top of it, we also got changes to Trickster. Heartstopper got buffed, and right now we'll take 50% less damage from hits and 50% less damage from overtime instead of 40 that we had before. However, we need to mention that Heartstopper is not really popular, and at the moment I believe that it's not going to be taken that often, even when it's 50 instead of 40. Soul Drinker, on the other hand, got nerfed, because you're no longer receiving 20% increased attack and cast speed while leeching Energy Shield. Considering that Trickster had an overleech and been leeching almost always, I believe like Soul Drinker is definitely receiving a nerf, because you're practically just losing 20% attack speed. And Spellbreaker got changed as well. You're not receiving 20% chance to suppress spell damage anymore. But now we'll prevent like 15% of suppressed spell damage while on full Energy Shield, compared to 10 that we had previously. I think it will make all spell suppression a little harder to maintain for Trickster, because you will need to get 20 additional spell suppression somewhere. It's mostly going to come from your tree, so you will need to waste more points, which is definitely going to hurt some builds. And since spell suppression got nerfed overall, and right now you will suppress less damage in general, so like 40 instead of 50. I believe hit for Spellbreaker will make especially early game harder. And amount of spell suppressed spell damage when you on full energy shield is not going to change much, because 5% that we got here is not even compensating for general nerfs. We are still 5% down. And another prominent nerf right here is one step ahead. Before, one step ahead been giving you 108 action speed, so you practically received 8% of attack speed, 8% of movement speed, in almost all situations. Right now, it will give you your action speed at least 90% of the base value, so it's still going to protect you against like slows, but it's not going to give you attack speed or movement speed or anything on top. Also, you still will be slowed even for 10% in the situation when enemies around casting something on you like chill. And nearby monsters' action speed will be 90 instead of 92, which is a very small change, and I don't think it will affect anything. I think that at the current situation, people will still take one step ahead, because one step ahead is very important to protect the Trickster against like heavy debuffs, chills, freeze, petrification, and stuff like that. Especially considering we will have like buffs in the maps, especially in tier 17, which will be very uncomfortable. But you're practically losing damage out of nothing at both Spellbreaker, because you will need to lose some points that you will practically take out of damage, and Soul Drinker. So after all those changes, I believe that Trickster is still completely playable, but it will be less popular, especially at the start, because it's harder to scale it. But it still will stay a very solid option in the endgame and one of the strongest ascendancies to pick, because even after the nerf, it's still looking tremendously good. And another nerf that we got here is Elementalist. For some reason, GG decided to hit Elementalist buffs based on golems, so Liege of Primordial now will provide only 50% increased of buffs granted by your golems, and previously it's been 100. I'm not really sure why GG decided to do that, considering the golems builds are not even that popular at the moment, but it's a pretty noticeable nerf because you will need to reshuffle some parts of your build, since you're losing mostly utility and defenses that golems been providing before. There have also been small changes to like Bard skin at the Warden, which people not really playing that often. Same goes for Necromancer, which got a slight buff, and Corpse Pact will be able to give you attack and cast speed for Corpse consumed a little faster. And that's pretty much all changes for the Ascendancies. So we can just consider it nerfs for Trickster and Elementalist. The last node that I would probably mention here is Saboteur, because like Clockwork, Notable Ascendancy will now grant you 40% increased cooldown recovery rate instead of 30. I think it could be nice for a few niche builds, but not going to change much, especially considering that Saboteur is not really popular Ascendancy at the moment. So in terms of Ascendancy, I believe that biggest winners is pretty much builds that just stayed untouched. And I think right now it probably would be Slayer, which been pretty popular before. It would be a Necromancer together with a Cultist, because both of them been pretty popular before and none of them touched completely, especially with their skills too. Trickster got nerfed, but I still think it will be popular, and it's hard to call it a loser Ascendancy. Same goes for things like Chieftain, which will probably need to change the main skill if they don't want to play a Fissure, but there's a lot of options for it, for example like Earthshatter. And in the end, it's a very funny moment that GG decided to focus, for example, on Elementalist and Trickster instead of going for Slayer, which has been a very popular Ascendancy for a long time. I also consider Hierophant is a pretty big winner of the patch because it's almost untouched as well, and there's a lot of spell options in the game right now that could provide both survivability and nice damage. So I believe you'll see more like Mana Stacker builds or hybrid builds on Hierophant. So that's been pretty much it for the build-related part of the patch notes. There have been also other changes, mostly nerfs to popular types of farm, which is going to lead to less loot in the endgame, but that's a topic for another video. Let me know in the comments what are you going to play, like what builds are looking nice for you, and do you think it will be League of Bows, for example, or League of Melee, or what kind of impression you currently have? Thank you very much for watching, and see you next time. ronarray out.